Welcome back, everyone. We are jumping right into the cage today for a brand new explainer on the absolute sheer science behind mixed martial arts. Today, we're taking a really close look at the anatomy of a fighter. We're going to break down the physics, the physiology, and the performance metrics that separate your average gym goer from actual world champions. If you've ever watched a fight and found yourself wondering what on earth is happening under the hood of these incredible athletes, well, you are definitely in the right place. To kick things off, we are answering a hugely debated question pulled straight from Reddit. How do MMA fighters get jacked without a traditional weightlifting regimen? It's such a great question, isn't it? I mean, we usually assume that getting a shredded physique means you have to basically live under a heavy barbell. But fighters don't train like bodybuilders. Yet they step into the octagon looking like Greek statues, while the rest of us just want to, carry the groceries inside in one trip. So why exactly is that? Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, combat versus bodybuilding. Second, the McGregor gas tank. Third, inside the fighter's engine. And finally, we'll look at leverage as the ultimate equalizer. Section 1, combat versus bodybuilding, the training shift. Right off the bat, we need to completely debunk the myth that you need heavy 5x5 squats to look like a professional fighter. The differences here are just stark. Traditional bodybuilding is all about isolation, chasing hypertrophy, and hitting those heavy compound lifts. The goal there is just sheer bulk. MMA training, on the other hand, requires mixed intensity volume. As actual martial artists point out when discussing their regimens, they often drop heavy compound lifts entirely because, frankly, they just don't translate well to striking or grappling. Instead, it's all about functional explosiveness. We are talking explosive medicine ball throws, nonstop sparring where you're constantly moving for 5 solid minutes, and kettlebell sets hitting that brutal 13 to 18 rep range. This specific type of training builds incredibly lean, highly functional muscle. To really grasp the muscular adaptation happening here, read this quote from our sources. In grappling, there is extreme amounts of time under tension. In striking, the practitioner has to perform countless explosive movements. Just think about that for a second. When two fighters are grappling on the mat, their muscles are locked in isometric holds, literally fighting against another human being's maximum resistance for minutes at a time. And then, in striking, they're throwing hundreds of punches and kicks. The sport itself literally forces the muscles to adapt, to grow, and to condense for better blood flow and retain strength. And then, there is the sheer volume of the work. An elite MMA fighter is often training up to 24 hours a week. Yeah, 24 hours. That is 4 hours a day split into 2 grueling sessions, 6 days a week. You simply cannot recreate that kind of massive caloric burn with 3 90-minute bodybuilding sessions a week. This immense, relentless volume strips away body fat, revealing that massive shredded V-taper that fans always point out. They build muscle in spite of not strictly lifting for size, simply because of the insane, nonstop work ethic the sport demands. Moving on to Section 2, the McGregor gas tank, explosiveness versus endurance. But listen, looking good is really only half the battle. Let's shift gears to internal engine capabilities, which brings us to a famously massive internet debate. Why do elite fighters like Conor McGregor gas out so quickly? We've all seen it, right? Guys who look like absolute world beaters in the very first round suddenly start fading hard by the middle of the second. Is it just laziness? Are they skipping their road work? Actually, no. The answer is deeply rooted in their biology. Now, what's really interesting here is the biology behind that fatigue, and it all comes down to muscle fibers. Conor McGregor's muscles, for instance, are largely made up of fast-twitch muscle fibers. These specific fibers allow for incredibly explosive bursts of movement, which is exactly why he possesses that legendary one-punch knockout power. But there is a massive biological downside. Fast-twitch fibers have remarkably low endurance, and they generate a huge buildup of lactic acid. When McGregor loads up on those heavy, precise left hands, he is essentially burning through his oxygen supply at double the normal speed. There's this brilliant analogy floating around the MMA community that compares fighters to runners and animals. Basically, McGregor is a sprinter, or, a cheetah. A cheetah is the fastest land animal on Earth, right? But it can only sprint for about 20 seconds before its brain literally starts to overheat. McGregor is explosive, but he fatigues fast. On the totally opposite side of the spectrum, you have guys like Nate Diaz or Khabib Nurmagomedov. They are built biologically like marathon runners. Their muscle fibers are predominantly slow twitch, meaning they might not have that terrifying one-punch power, but they can continuously maintain a grueling, incredibly high pace that fast-twitch fighters simply cannot keep up with over 15 or 25 minutes. So if you're born a fast-twitch fighter, Are you just doomed to gas out every time? Well, not necessarily. Just look at the Yoel Romero strategy. Romero's arguably one of the most explosive athletes in combat sports history, packed to the gills with fast twitch fibers, but he manages his gas tank brilliantly. How does he do it? By strictly controlling his pacing. He plods along slowly, doing very little to conserve energy. Then, the second he sees an opening, he explodes like a cannon. And immediately after, he reverts right back to plodding. He absolutely refuses to maintain a medium-high pace, saving his limited fast-twitch energy for the exact, crucial moments it matters most. Which brings us to Section 3, Inside the Fighter's Engine. Let's look at some hard lab data. Let's actually move away from the Reddit theories for a minute and jump into some peer-reviewed science. To truly understand what happens to a fighter's cardiovascular system, researchers at IU Indianapolis conducted a maximum treadmill study. And they didn't just grab casual gym goers for this. They tested 20 elite, world-class professional MMA fighters just 8 weeks before their actual pro bouts. They strapped them up to VO2 masks and heart rate monitors and basically just pushed them to total exhaustion on a treadmill to see exactly where their biological limits were. So the researchers divided these fighters into two groups, those fighting under 185 pounds and those at or above 185. And despite the obvious massive differences in body mass, with the heavyweights naturally carrying way more weight, their actual performance metrics were shockingly similar. Both groups hit their absolute breaking point, their time to exhaustion, at almost exactly the same time, an average of 8.1 minutes on this incredibly brutal ramp protocol. Their peak heart rates were also nearly identical, hovering right around 180 to 184 beats per minute. And this brilliantly illustrates the core physiological difference between weight classes. VO2 max, which is your maximum rate of oxygen consumption, was literally the only physiological variable that differed significantly here. The lighter fighters had a VO2 max of 53.4, while the heavier guys sat lower at 48.1. That is exactly a 10.4% difference in oxygen uptake. But here's the critical takeaway from the researchers, so don't miss this. This difference isn't because heavyweights are somehow lazier or less conditioned. It's largely dictated by body mass itself. Cardiac output just has to work harder to supply oxygen to a larger frame. Makes sense, right? So across the board, elite MMA fighters are tuned to incredibly similar, highly optimized anaerobic thresholds, whether they weigh 155 pounds or 265 pounds. All right, final section, Section 4, leverage, the ultimate equalizer. Because having a perfectly tuned cardiovascular engine and ripped muscles means absolutely nothing if you don't understand basic physics. Read this quote carefully. Think of leverage like using a crowbar to lift a heavy object. Rather than relying on sheer muscle, the tool's length and positioning do the work. In combat sports, and particularly in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, your body is that tool. By positioning your joints and limbs correctly, you use mechanical advantage to amplify your force. This is precisely how a much smaller, weaker fighter can completely dominate and submit a larger opponent. So how does this actually work? The mechanics of leverage break down into 3 core concepts. First, posture and base. If your structure is strong, your opponent simply cannot exploit weak points. Second, optimal angles. Getting yourself to a 90-degree angle relative to your opponent exponentially increases your control while drastically reducing the effort you have to put in. And third, strategic weight distribution. Shifting your weight properly generates massive pressure on them without requiring you to flex a single muscle. Let's move to a real-world example and see how this builds into a practical, step-by-step application in the cage. Take executing an arm bar. Step 1, you isolate the opponent's limb. Step 2, place your hips tightly against their joint, essentially turning your own hips into a fulcrum. Step 3, pull down using the strength of your entire core, your back and your legs, against just the small joint of their elbow. You are using whole body mechanical advantage against one single isolated point. It is pure, unadulterated physics. So, the crucial point here is this. Relying on strength alone, it's a total trap. If you rely on pure muscular force, you will experience rapid fatigue. We literally just saw this with the fast twitch muscle fiber data. Muscular force requires massive energy expenditure. Technique and leverage, however, conserve energy. By using body mechanics smartly, a fighter preserves their gas tank for those deep later rounds when brute strength has completely evaporated. Bringing it all together, we can clearly see that elite combat performance is a really delicate balance. On one side, you have the anatomy, your genetic makeup of fast or slow twitch muscle fibers, and your cardiovascular VO2 max that you've developed through hours of insane conditioning. On the other side, you have physics, the masterful application of leverage, angles, and technique that allows you to amplify your power and conserve that precious oxygen. A true world-class fighter is the perfect marriage of biological tuning and applied physics. Which leads us to our final thought for today. The next time you watch two fighters step into the cage, I want you to ask yourself, is fighting just a contest of raw muscle, or is it a masterful application of physics and biology? Because once you understand the underlying science, every single punch, every heavy breath, and every complex grappling exchange becomes this fascinating, high-stakes equation of human performance. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you all next time.